It was the morning of Saturday, May 1st, 1999 in Zwaagwestende, the Netherlands, that Bouke and Marianne Vaatstra noticed that their 16-year-old daughter Mariana had not returned home from a night out with her boyfriend the previous evening. Bouke called her boyfriend Spencer's home and found out that the couple had found a bicycle for Mariana to ride home on, which she did, alone, in the dark at about 1 a.m. Mika suggested calling the police right away, but Bouke thought that he should go out and look for Mariana first. He got in his car and drove the route that his daughter might have taken home in the early morning hours. Eventually, Bouke returned home without finding Mariana and started calling other people. He called her best friend Afka as well as his older sons, Mariana's brothers. They all started searching for the missing teen. When 10 a.m. hit and they hadn't found Mariana, her parents called the police, who showed up at the house and made a missing persons report. While Bouke and Mika were speaking with the police, Afka and her boyfriend Hans were driving around looking for clues to where Mariana could be. While driving on a road between Spencer's house and Mariana's house, they spotted a bicycle lying in a ditch. It matched the description of the bike Mariana had left on. Afka and her boyfriend stopped and waited for Spencer to arrive, who confirmed the bike was definitely the one Mariana had been riding. When he showed up, he was positive that it was the same bicycle. While Afka stayed in the car and called Bouke, Spencer and Hans walked into the wooded area on the side of the road. They followed a path in the woods and eventually found Mariana, almost fully nude, lying on the ground. When Hans reached down to feel her pulse, he found none. It would take more than 12 years for investigators to track down the man who took Mariana's life, and it would not turn out to be who the community thought it was. This is Monsters. Dutch is not the only language people speak in the Netherlands. There's a municipality in northern Netherlands called Friesland where the residents commonly speak a language called Frisian. This story took place in a town that now goes by its Frisian name De Westeren, but at the time the crime happened, the town was called Zwaagwestende, which is Dutch. They changed the name in 2008, which was between when the crime happened in 1999 and when it was finally solved in 2012. Marianne Vaatstra was born on August 10, 1982 to Bouke and Marianne Vaatstra. She was the youngest of 6 children and 12 years younger than the next oldest child, her brother Johan. The oldest was Freddie in his 20s, and she had 3 sisters, Rennie, Ineke, and Wilma. By 1999, Mariana was the last child still living at home, and she spent time at her siblings' houses with their families quite often. In high school, Mariana met Afka, and they became immediate best friends. It wasn't uncommon for the girls to go out and for Mariana to just stay over at Afka's house. They would go out to nightclubs, but Mariana didn't drive, so she would usually get a ride from her father or one of her siblings, then would get a taxi back home. Mariana entered her final year of high school in 1998 and was working a part-time job at a local supermarket, just a few days a week for some extra pocket money. That was the same year she met Spencer at a nightclub and fell in love. He lived about 10 kilometers or 6 miles east, and they mainly saw each other on weekends. In April of 1999, Mariana took her final exams in high school and learned that she had been accepted to a nearby hairdressing school. She had no idea that she only had a week to live. In the Netherlands, one of the biggest national holidays is King's Day, which is regularly celebrated on April 27th. Before 2014, though, the head of state was a queen, and it was called Queen's Day, which was celebrated on April 30th, Queen Juliana's birthday. So in 1999, Mariana went out with Spencer on the 30th, which was a Friday night, to celebrate. Mariana got dressed up and left the house with a small backpack with black and white cow print on it. She and Spencer went to the nearby town of Colum to a nightclub called Paradiso. She told her parents that Spencer was going to hire a taxi to take her home. The parents worried about the safety of their youngest child late at night, like any parent would. The club was full of energy, with the occupants drinking and dancing. The couple spent the evening celebrating, and at about 1 a.m. they left the club and started making their way home. Despite Mariana's parents being sure that they were told their daughter would be taking a taxi home, there was no plan to hire one by the teenagers. Mariana rode on the back of Spencer's bike to a train station near his home. There they broke the lock on a random bicycle, and Mariana rode from there on her own toward her home, a trip that would have taken 20 to 30 minutes. The light on the bike didn't work, and she disappeared into the darkness. Paramedics arrived on the scene at about 11 a.m. and confirmed that Mariana was dead. She was lying on her stomach on top of her coat. Her head was on her cow print backpack. Her shirt was pulled up and her leggings were almost completely off. They were hanging on to one foot. Her underwear were lying on the ground near her body. Her bra was around her neck and her throat had been cut. There was a small wound on her hand. Mariana's body was wrapped to keep any forensic evidence intact, and the personal belongings around her were collected. Crime scene investigators also found footprints from 2 separate people. One matched Mariana and only went into the wooded area. The other went in and then back out of the wooded area. During the autopsy, the medical examiner determined that Mariana had been sexually assaulted, strangled, and then had her throat cut. It looked like the killer made 3 distinct cuts to her neck in order to get the job done. A number of biological samples were taken from Mariana's body. There was semen found around her genitals as well as on her bra. Blood found on both of her wrists was determined to not be hers. 2 foreign pubic hairs were found, one on her body and one on her coat. There was also saliva on her left breast. All of the DNA pulled from the evidence came back a match to each other, but without DNA in the system, it wasn't much use to the investigators, at least at the time. There were a few hundred DNA samples in the system, but none were a match. Spencer was the first person questioned because he was her boyfriend and the last person to see her. Investigators questioned him for 3 hours and said his story was consistent and he seemed genuinely upset about the murder. He would go on to be interviewed 2 more times, but would not end up a serious suspect. With not much evidence beside a shoe print and some unmatched DNA, the investigators didn't have many suspects. As soon as the murder was discovered, locals believed that the perpetrator must have been someone from a nearby asylum seekers center. The asylum center in Column housed hopeful immigrants from mainly the Middle East. It was only a kilometer from the crime scene, and the fear of foreigners was just as strong back then as it is now. And I get that it's easier to believe a stranger is responsible for a horrible crime instead of someone from your community. But like many other times in history, the immigrants became a scapegoat. That didn't mean there weren't a few legitimate leads who lived there. The police got a report that an Iraqi teenager, 15-year-old Fiq Mustafa, and a few of his friends had harassed Mariana at a nightclub the previous February, and that Fiq had made a slicing motion across his throat to her. Obviously something the authorities took seriously, seeing how Mariana had been killed. His DNA was eventually obtained and wasn't a match for the DNA found on the victim. Despite that, the media again reporting that the murderer was not a Westerner, making more and more locals sure the perp was from the asylum center. Rumors started spreading that the asylum seekers were committing violent crimes and that the police were not doing anything about it. That got the locals more worked up, and the unrest around the center increased, with more and more threats being levied against the asylum seekers. A private security company was brought in to protect the center, and police made a public appeal for people to not take the law into their own hands. And whatever your feelings are about immigrants or asylum seekers, that was all a waste of time and money, since there was no evidence that the murderer had been living in the center. Because they weren't. It was all paranoia based on xenophobia. Still, 2 more suspects came from the ranks of the asylum center. The head of the center reported that 2 men who had been living there had disappeared in the days around the murder. They were both supposed to obtain a new stamp from the immigration office on May 12th, but didn't. The first was 19-year-old Mohammed Akbari from Afghanistan, and the other was 26-year-old Ali Hussein Hassan from Iraq. The investigators would put the two names on their list, but it would take time for the men to be located internationally, and them leaving the area wasn't a guarantee either of them was the killer, though the area residents were sure that was the case. On May 28, the suspect was arrested, and to everyone's shock, it was a local resident. It's unclear what made the 32-year-old man a suspect, but he lived near the Vaatstras. His home was searched and he was questioned, but released after 4 days. The case was once again sans suspect. Bauke had known the man since he was a boy and knew he wasn't involved in the murder of Mariana. In June, a man who was seen walking in the area the night of the murder turned himself into police. His DNA was taken and was not a match to the killer. They say that time heals all wounds, but sometimes it just makes them worse, especially when there are no answers to the violent murder of a loved one. With each passing day, week, month, people became more and more upset that the police had not found Mariana's killer. None of those people were more angry than Bauke and Meka. Their grief, with no answers to quell it, just resonated into the belief that the authorities were covering up who the murderer was. The Vaatstras became convinced that an asylum seeker was responsible, but the police were protecting them, and their anger at the foreigners in their community grew. On October 7th, a protest was held regarding the proposal of a new asylum seeker center being built in the area. There, while officials were talking about plans, a few people caused a small uprising that was quickly subdued by the authorities. The situation in Friesland was becoming tense, with the investigation into Mariana's death becoming a trigger for people who didn't trust the foreigners in the area who were looking for asylum. Unfortunately, no amount of outrage towards immigrants would help the investigators find the killer. 2 days after the protest, Ali Hussein Hassan was arrested in Istanbul, Turkey, and questioned by Frisian police who traveled to the country. He told the authorities that he had simply left because he was no longer interested in living in the Netherlands and that he wasn't even aware of a murder until they brought it up during the interview. He willingly provided the investigators with a DNA sample, which was not a match to the killer's DNA. Hassan was released and only one named remained on the suspect list. As the end of the year closed in, investigators were under growing pressure to solve the case, so they came up with a list of 150 men who might have been involved in the crime and requested DNA samples. They asked to give the DNA voluntarily, and they would destroy the sample after they were found to be not a match, not putting it in the system. That effort took place throughout 2000 and resulted in no DNA matches. The next thing the authorities tried to get a better sense of who the killer was to have an evolutionary geneticist look into determining the ethnicity of the killer through their DNA. The geneticist concluded the DNA came from a Caucasian male who was from northwestern Europe. Of course, that information caused quite a bit of controversy throughout the community, as most people, including Bauke and Meka, refused to believe that the rapist and murderer was not a foreigner. The months would turn into years, and the authorities collected DNA from a wider group of people, which again did not result in a match. The Vaatstras continued to be convinced that someone from the asylum center had murdered their daughter, and they started carrying out their own investigation. They eventually got involved with a small group of conspiracy theorists, and their effort to investigate their daughter's murder only focusing on finding a foreigner was counterintuitive to the official investigation. The police requested they stop their investigation, but they refused. In the following years, Bauke and Meka separated, but continued to share the strong belief that an asylum seeker killed their daughter. They believed that the profile from the geneticist made the authorities only focus on Westerners and the real killers were getting away. Ironic, because it was exactly what they were doing, only focusing on asylum seekers. The group of conspiracy theorists that the Vaatstras were working with had gone public with their belief that the wrong Ali Hussein Hassan had been arrested in Istanbul and the real Hassan was still the killer. They claimed that Fik Mustafa had actually kidnapped Mariana and taken her to Hassan, who then killed her. Then the perpetrators were whisked away to a different asylum center. It was complete paranoid fiction, but it was gaining traction with the community. The years passed and news of the investigation got quieter. Eventually, the case got shelved until new evidence could be found. At the same time, new laws regarding DNA were being argued in The Hague. The authorities were trying to get laws passed that would allow them to do DNA testing to look for familial matches with DNA evidence collected. It was a slow process, but in November of 2011, a law allowing for the collection of DNA to look for a familial match was passed, and it took effect on April 1, 2012. As soon as the new law was active, police began using DNA they had already collected to search for familial matches in the system, but they were unsuccessful. On May 20th, the police announced a wide-scale DNA collection effort to find a familial match to the DNA collected from the scene of the crime. It was the final action taken by authorities that would finally reveal the identity of the elusive killer. Jasper Steringa was born on May 25, 1967 in Oud-Woude, just north of where the crime took place. His family had owned a farm for centuries, and Jasper, being the only son to his parents, ended up taking over the farm. He was said to have a decent upbringing and did well in school. He did end up developing a strong need for sex, and he was known to engage in unsafe sex regularly. In his early 20s, his girlfriend got pregnant, and they got married because of it. They seemed to do well together, and they had a second child, but underneath, Jasper was struggling with his high sex drive and not being fully satisfied at home. Starting in 1994, about 3 times a year, Jasper would go to a red light district in a town 30 kilometers or 18 miles away and engage in hired sex. That seemed to keep his desires at bay, and there was no record that Jasper had ever been violent. That was until May 1st, 1999. That night, Jasper had gone out and satisfied his need for sex forcibly. Then he returned home and never spoke of it. He was not a repeat offender, which is what kept the authorities from ever having his DNA wind up in the system. He was completely unrelated to Mariana and had no criminal record, so investigators never included him in one of their previous DNA collections. The closest he ever came was, one night in 2008, he got drunk and stole a car. He got pulled over while out joyriding and was arrested. It was not a violent crime and didn't require him to provide a DNA sample. He eventually went to court and was given a fine, never being revealed as the rapist and murderer he really was. So when the police announced that they were collecting DNA in 2012, Jasper knew it would finally reveal the truth, but he willingly went to the police and gave a sample anyway. To much surprise, the DNA was not a familial match, but a perfect match for the evidence collected at the scene. Jasper Steringa was arrested on his farm on November 18, 2012, and taken to the police station for an interview. He would later say that the arrest was a relief, as he had been tormented by what he had done for years, but even then he refused to talk. He was assigned a lawyer, and after spending 2.5 weeks on lockdown in jail, only communicating with his legal counsel, Jasper finally sat down with investigators and confessed to what he had done on May 1, 1999. His trial began in March of 2013, where Jasper went through the events that led up to the rape and murder. He said he had been at home with his wife and children asleep upstairs. He went to sleep downstairs but woke up at about 1:30 a.m. sexually frustrated and decided to go for a bike ride. He said he ended up near the roundabout where Mariana was found, but he can't recall how he got there. He said that Mariana passed him on her bike and he immediately decided to attack her. He turned around and raced to catch up with her. He grabbed her and they both fell to the ground. She bit his hand hard enough to make him bleed, which is where the blood on her wrists came from. He finally wrestled her to the ground and put the knife he had in his work pants to her throat. He first made her perform oral sex, then started cutting off her clothes and then raped her vaginally. He claimed that when he was finished with the rape, the rush suddenly left him and he realized what he was doing. He rolled her over and began strangling her until she passed out. Then he pulled her head back and ran the knife across her throat 3 times until he heard blood flowing. After testimony from a psychiatrist to confirm that Jasper was not diagnosed with anything that would explain or excuse his crime, Jasper Steringa was found guilty of the murder and sentenced to 18 years in prison. It would be an exceptionally light sentence by many standards, but Jasper's defense argued it was too harsh since his client had a clean record before and after the murder. I don't know that really justifies a light sentence for brutally raping and killing a teenager, but that was how it went, and Jasper was released on parole in 2024 after serving 12 years. His release came with strong restrictions barring him from entering the municipalities of Friesland, Groningen, and Drenthe, all places where Mariana's family lives. Can someone commit one horrible act and go on to not be a danger to society after that? Jasper is almost 60, but that doesn't mean he couldn't snap again and harm another young person before his life ends. Only time will tell if Jasper Steringa remains a one-time monster or if he will use his freedom to destroy another innocent life. Thanks for watching This Is Monsters. New episodes are uploaded twice a week on Mondays and Thursdays. There are occasional bonus episodes covering unsolved cases and criminal history. If you have a suggestion for a case you think I should cover, leave it in the comments. You can always follow the channel on Instagram at thisis_monsters and purchase merch at thisismonsters.com. Thanks so much, and be safe.